Hello, we are here for our second exploration into MCU, our favorite heroes, their leadership, its connection to Gene Keys. So excited. We are diving in to the 31st Gene Key with the case study, the archetype of Steve Rogers' journey through the MCU. Steve Rogers is definitely one of my favorites. The 31st Gene Key is the Gene Key that I have in my purpose sphere, so I feel a really deep connection to this Gene Key, and watching Steve Rogers' journey through the MCU was such an amazing way for me to explore this gene key within myself. So if you have the 31st gene key, I'm definitely very interested to hear your thoughts and reflections, your contemplations. And even if you don't, I would love to hear your thoughts from a perspective of not having this gene key active in your profile. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the last call, but we can have these intuitive connections to each of the gene keys, regardless of if they are active in our profile. And the 64 gene keys also represent universal themes within humanity. So there are threads that we will feel connected to either through what we see in others or what we experience ourselves, regardless of if it is actually present in our profile. So the 31st gene key is one of the core three leadership codes within the gene keys. And this is leadership through the voice. It's using language to lead. So the journey is the shadow of arrogance, the gift of leadership, and the city of humility. This is a very basic summarized explanation of these three frequencies within this 31st gene key. So the shadow of arrogance is really rooted in the belief that you have this independent control over your reality, that it is by your moral code, your choices, your actions that determine how you're living. And they do to an extent, but the arrogance comes from not seeing the force of life itself, and that some things are just out of your control, and that not you can't bend everyone to the way that you see the world. So with this arrogance, there's this use of language to manipulate others into doing what you believe is right. And in the shadow, it's like the arrogance of believing that your view of the world is the right view, or is the view that others should adopt as well. So even though sometimes from the outside we can see these people who are leaders, who are leading these big causes, like there is this flavor of arrogance that they believe they are doing the right thing. And sometimes what they believe is the right thing is what a lot of others believe is the right thing, and sometimes it's not. And we'll explore that as we go through this call. So there, in this shot of arrogance, there can also be this like subtle belief that you are better than the people you are leading. And by better, like more capable, more powerful, you have more integrity. Just like there's something about you that makes you like more superior in some way, that you place yourself above those in some way. And in leadership, when you place yourself above the people you are leading, it can create even more arrogance. And because what is linked to the shadow of arrogance also is this need for recognition. And sometimes, like, if you get the recognition from people that you place below you, the recognition actually means nothing. So it's kind of like this vicious cycle. um I said that there's this deep-seated need for recognition, and you can become a victim of needing to be heard or needing to be recognized in a certain way. There's this fear in this shadow as well as being seen as arrogant. And with every shadow within the gene keys, there is a repressive and a reactive side. The reactive side of arrogance are, like the bullies of the world, people who actively put themselves above others, who actively you know, use their words to hurt others, who use their words to manipulate others. And then there is the repressive side, and that's more where this fear of being seen as arrogant is, and where it's like this very internal belief that you know better than others. And sometimes giving your power to others that you see as above you as well. So there's this ranking of people in both sides of this arrogance shadow. And then we move into the gift of leadership. And this is about being the voice of the collective. In this gift, you are really designed to have your finger on the pulse of humanity, to be so deeply connected to humanity, to lead it from within. I'm noticing a few typos within this, so ignore them. This gift of leadership is using language to influence. And when you're in the gift frequency of this 31st gene key, your influence outweighs your content. Like, it doesn't really matter what you're saying as long as you're saying something, and that you are using your words to lead in whatever way you're leading. Often um often this style of leadership within the 31st gene key is about helping other people break through the conditioning that you were once in. So it can be really powerful in that way. And this is really a gift of no longer being concerned what other people think of you, and not letting what other people may think of you get in the way of your leadership. This is leadership that is really earned through lived experience. So when we look at the shadow of arrogance and the gift of leadership, there is this really fine line of, in the gift of leadership, you stand for what you believe in, and you let that be the driving force in your leadership. And there is still this hint of what could be seen as arrogance in that like, you have to believe, you have to take a stand for what you believe in. But it can drop into that arrogance of thinking that that is above what anyone else could ever think. And, that is seen very heavily throughout the journey of Steve Rogers, which we will explore. And then humility, when we get to the city, is, being truly humble, having truly no agenda, surrendering to life. We'll explore a little bit about the city as well, but we're going to focus mainly on the shadow and the gift. All right, so Steve Rogers was in a lot of the MCU movies. He had his 3 movies, and then he was in all of the Avengers movies as well. So I'm not going to go into like the full plot and the full story of every single one of these movies in a lot of detail, because we just don't have time. So I'm really just gonna pull out the details that I think are relevant to Steve's like story arc, to his journey, to his evolution, particularly focused around this 31st gene key. And what I think watching these movies and like being a fan of these movies really helps for you to kind of fill in the gaps and connect to the story. So you may need to give yourself a little refresh and watch some of these movies again. But when I talk about certain scenes, like, they really are key scenes that I think you will remember, or that will feel somewhat familiar if you've seen these movies. So we'll start with when we meet Steve Rogers in Captain America, the First Avenger, his first solo movie. I'm just going to move this so I can see all the writing. Okay, so we first meet Steve Rogers back in the 1940s when World War II was happening. And he is, this little guy. He has I recently watched a bit of this movie again, or like I watched some recaps, and it is really strange seeing like Chris Evans, the actor, as like how they have him at the start of this movie. But we see him as this little guy. He has asthma, he has a range of other health issues, and we see him as this person who doesn't fit kind of like the standard of the other men that we see around him. And he is someone that has been bullied his whole life, and we see that he's made a bit of a habit of getting into fights with bullies. And we hear his famous line even before he makes his transformation into Captain America, that I can do this all day. And we see his arrogance already shining in that before he has his powers. It's like at the core of who he is, that he has this arrogance that makes him feel like he has something to prove. And it's very connected to bullies. Like, he wants to stand up to bullies and he wants to fight bullies. And that is one of his key drivers into wanting to join the war as a soldier, even though he's been rejected many times because of his health conditions. He wants to stand up to the bullies that, like, he sees, the core perpetrators in World War II as bullies that he wants to fight. And there's that arrogance in him that says, yes, I can go up against these bullies, and I deserve to fight them. And I think it's really interesting with Steve and with a lot of heroes, I think you'll see this reflected that often their antagonist or like the villains, the antagonists, the people that they go up against often will reflect shadow pieces of them. And Steve always goes up against people that he views as bullies. And that is, a core part of this shadow of arrogance in the reactive sense of becoming a bully because of your arrogance. The people on the other side of World War II, talking about how they're depicted in the movie, like they actually do believe that they are doing the right thing, that they are in the right, and they are taking extreme measures to stand up for what they believe in and what they believe is right. Like they are displaying their arrogance and becoming bullies as a part of it. Whereas Steve still has that arrogance of believing that he is right and the stance that he is taking is right. But he's seen as a leader because of how we view his stance compared to what the other side are doing because of their stance. But there is still that arrogance there. So I think it's really interesting just to note the shadows that are in the side that we see heroes facing will often have subtle traces in them as well within their shadows as well. So then we see finally Steve is given the chance to join the military, to go into this special operation to find someone to give the super soldier serum to. And the person that developed the serum meets Steve before his transformation and wants to give him an opportunity because he's looking for someone that is a good person and a good leader as opposed to just a good soldier. So he joins. He's obviously physically not up to like the doesn't isn't fitting the mold of a soldier that we see all the other soldiers there, but there's moments where he proves like his character, where he gets the flag down by using his brain. He takes opportunities where he can. And then we see a key moment in Steve's transformation is when there is a grenade thrown into the training ground. And this is a test that all these soldiers and Steve are unaware of. And we see Steve throw himself on top of the grenade and yells at everyone, get back, get back. And this is a really key moment that demonstrates Steve's willingness to lead by example, to be the leader. But we also see, there still is arrogance within that, he had to be the one to sacrifice himself, that he had to be the one, to make that play. And sometimes arrogance can blind people with the 31st gene key of other choices, of what better options could have been. Like they're just immediately in action and I need to do this. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if that was a real grenade, yes, Steve like perhaps would have saved many people by sacrificing himself for it. But this is a theme that we see continue, that Steve always has to be the one to make the sacrifice, to just jump head in and do something. And yes, while that is serving, there is like that subtle arrogance in it that he has to be the one to do it because he thinks he's more suited than anyone else. We'll see that come up and how the movie ends. We see that on full display. So Steve is chosen to take the super soldier serum because of his humility, because of his heart. And this is why he is chosen by the person that created the serum, that he knows the person that created the serum knows that all of whoever takes it will be amplified, not just his physical strength, not just his abilities, but what is in his heart. And Steve ultimately has like that gift of leadership and humanity and wanting to be of service at his heart, even though he has these shadows as well. But remember, in every shadow is the gift and is a gift. So just because I will continually say arrogance is present doesn't mean I'm saying that as a bad thing. It's just about noticing when his arrogance is used in service and when it is used to service his ego and himself and to make him a little destructive and self-sabotaging. So he takes the serum. He, immediately the place where he became where he took the serum was like under attack. The person that made the serum was killed. So immediately he is on like full display of his new physique, his new abilities by running down like the person that tried to steal the serum and stuff like that. So we see him and he's like ready to fight. He's like, yes, like I can finally be a full soldier in this battle. Like I can finally fully fight. But the military immediately sideline him as a symbol, when all he really wants to do is fight. He wants to fight these bullies. And again, like that's arrogance coming through. So as soon as he's, he's going around like the country doing performances, like he is a symbol of hope, of patriotism. And I think this goes on for like a fair while of time. I can't remember exactly how long. I think at least months, like maybe even longer. And then he comes to do a show at an army base where I'm pretty sure it was the base where he was doing his training. He goes to do like his performance, it's like a full like musical performance kind of thing. So he's there, and then he finds out that where Bucky was assigned to within the military, they have been captured, they assume dead, they're behind enemy lines. To rewind a little, if you've watched the movies, of course you're well aware of who Bucky is, but Bucky is his, childhood friend who is basically family, like the only family that Steve has. And Bucky kind of, represents a lot of the things that Steve wants to be in a lot of ways. Like, he got to be a soldier. He's, like a ladies' man, like he's confident, he's he's seen as someone that is very capable in the world. But they are, very close, like family. So Steve discovers that Bucky is in danger. And as soon as he discovers this, like he defies orders to go on a rescue mission. Like Steve isn't authorized to go and fight in the field. So he disobeys orders. And then so Peggy and Howard Stark take him in a plane, and Peggy saying, it's too dangerous, you can't go in. But Steve again disobeys Peggy's orders as well and jumps down even when, everyone is determining it's unsafe and it's unsuitable for him. He's defying all these orders to go and rescue Bucky and all the others that are with Bucky. And I think there was like hundreds, like a lot of them. So he basically, proves his ability. He rescues everyone and they come back to the camp. And as soon as they get back, the military person that is in charge, walks up to them. Everyone's like kind of like in shock that, oh my God, they're back, because they assume that he had died like on this mission. And as soon as they get back, he says, I'm willing to turn myself in for disciplinary action. And of course, the military boss person is like, there's no need for that. Obviously you've proved yourself. But Steve was really willing to turn himself in for action. So part of this 31st Gene Key leadership style is that they are not afraid to break the rules if it means that they are serving a higher purpose or a cause. And there is that fine line with arrogance here, because the leader needs to believe that they know better than the authority, than the people that are telling them to do something else than they know is the right thing to do. And we see that even when Steve breaks the rules in this first movie, he still wants to be a good soldier. Like he was so willing to break the rules, but he was also willing to face the consequences according to the people he was giving authority, as a result, like of his actions. So then, and that's like important to note, because there is a huge shift in that in upcoming in his evolution. So then at the end of this movie, Steve sacrifices himself on the plane. There's at the end of the movie, the plane he's on, he defeats Red Skull. The Tesseract drops into the ocean, but there is like explosives on the plane, and he knows that if he lands it, it could explode and hurt civilians or hurt the people like wherever he lands it, and he doesn't know how much the damage could be. So he makes the decision to direct the plane like into the river or the ocean, like somewhere that's far away from civilization, and he sacrifices himself. Again, there is that arrogance, even if it was the right decision, and he becomes frozen in the ice. And then at the very end of the movie, I can't remember if this is the end of the movie or the post-credit scene, we see that he um is recovered some 70 years later. He was frozen in the ice, preserved, and then he is recovered in present time at the time the movie was made. Um and he's, a man out of time now because of that sacrifice that he made. So that is basically a very brief summary of the first movie. So then we move into where we meet Steve again in the Avengers movie. He has been recruited into the Avengers, the team up. And this is where Steve meets the rest of who will become the Avengers for the first time. And immediately he has conflict with Tony, with Iron Man. And this is because Steve sees Tony as someone who is arrogant. Like Steve is projecting his view of what it means to be arrogant onto Tony because Tony has different methods, has different approaches that don't align with, the perfect soldier that Steve wants to be. So immediately Steve projects his fear as of being seen as arrogant onto Tony by calling him arrogant. And something that is very common with this 31st shadow of arrogance is that it's very hard to see your own arrogance until you have been truly humbled by life, which we'll see in the future storyline of this as well. So the story continues, and Steve gets to know Tony, gets to see his true character, his true intentions, his true values, and they become a true team. And in my opinion, Steve and Tony become the dynamic duo to lead the Avengers team and to fight. And I'm not going to go too far into the details of that, but I am going to talk about Steve's relationship with Tony after I've gone through all of Steve's journey, because I feel I'll talk about it later. Okay, so part of this, a key moment in this movie that I think really demonstrates Steve in his gift of leadership is that, so part of this 31st Jinky leadership is leading by example before others will be willing to listen to you. And we see this in the final battle in New York, where the Chitauri are the aliens that are coming down and trying to take over or destroy New York. They're all over the place. The Avengers are fighting them, and then the police and the military and all of that come in to try to address this issue. And this is the first Avengers movie, so it heroes being in the world isn't as mainstream as it becomes in the MCU world. So the police are there thinking that they can do something to fight these alien beings and stuff. So they're there, and Steve comes and tries to talk to one and be like, we need to shut off this perimeter, do this, do this, do this. And the police officer is kind of like, who do you think you are? Like, what makes you think I'm gonna take orders from this random in a suit with a shield? And then some of the Chitauri, I think it was one or two, come, it may have been more, and Steve fights them off, in full display of his capability as a soldier and as someone that, knows what he's doing and knows what he's talking about. And then immediately the police on his scanner to communicate with all the other police repeats exactly what Steve just said. We need to do this, this, and this. Steve proved his authority, and others saw him as the leader and did what he said to fight in this battle. So he had to demonstrate his skills and his position himself as a leader before other people would take him seriously. So I thought that was a very key moment of demonstrating how this gift works. As soon as you prove yourself as a leader, other people will listen to you and other people will do what you say and follow you. And this can work in a shadow way where you manipulate others through your own arrogance, or in a high frequency as the gift where other people are following you in service to the collective and in service to the whole. This is a gift. This this gift of leadership is forged through life, through your life experience, and through how other people witness your life experience, which is a little different to the other leadership codes that we're going to dive into in our third and fourth com. So there's a lot of other things that happen in this movie, but they were the key points that I wanted to talk about. So then we move into the second Captain America, like solo focus movie, the Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And this is where we see a big this movie kind of culminates in like a big shift in Steve and in his evolution and his relationship with authority and being like that good soldier. So when we see Steve here, he has been working for Shield, so like basically like the government secret organization that formed like Nick Fury as part of Shield, and he brought the team of the Avengers together. He's been working for Shield, going on like covert operations, missions, all of that kind of stuff. And in the early stages of this movie, we see Steve discover that there is corruption and evil forces hiding in plain sight within Shield. So Hydra, the organization that he was fighting in his first Captain America movie, that, you know, like Hydra were basically Nazis in World War II, within the MCU universe, we find that Hydra have been hiding in Shield like since its conception. And all that corruption is kind of like coming to the surface, and Steve discovers it, which obviously, you know, he thought Hydra was defeated when he sacrificed himself, and he finds out that it wasn't. And you know, it's been here causing chaos in the world ever since then, since World War II, and before that as well. So basically, like him discovering it and everything that happens after that, Shield is basically destroyed. It results in the destruction of Shield and that organization falling. And this is also the movie. So there's that side of the movie, and the other side of the movie is that Steve is reconnected with Bucky. So Bucky died in the first Avengers movie. So I didn't even mention this when I was on that slide. But so after Steve like rescued Bucky and all those other soldiers, they became like this, a group of them became like this team that went on a lot of missions, that were doing, you know, a lot of good together. And then they were on a train, and basically Bucky falls down a very long fall like into the snow, and then it was assumed he was dead. Like it was assumed no one could ever survive that. And remember, like this is like 70 years later, more than 70 years later at this point. So Steve is obviously like very shocked and confused when he sees Bucky again. And also when he sees that Bucky is the Winter Soldier, this assassin that everyone is, you know, very afraid of, and that has been causing a lot of chaos, like, and you know, trying to assassinate Nick Fury and Steve Rogers and other people. So there's that side of that as well, and that kind of brings out this other side of evolution within Steve, that, you know, like he's willing to fight for Bucky no matter what. So this is the movie where we see Steve start to realize that being the good soldier is not always for the greater good, and giving authority to these organizations that say they are here to serve humanity isn't always in his best interest as a leader, because they're not always what they seem. So we start to see him develop this distrust in external powers, and it is really like solidified by the end of this movie. He takes a moral stand in his leadership and chooses to trust only those with the same values and the same like skin in the game as him. He doesn't want to take orders or go on missions for other people anymore. He really is solidified as like the full leader himself. Like he is the leader, not taking orders from anyone else at this point, and he's only going to trust his inner circle by the end of this movie. So he's still part of the Avengers team. He'll still like do team ups with them, and we'll see that in on the next slide when we go into Age of Ultron as well. But him being done with being controlled by others and taking orders from others is like set up in this movie, and it's really planting the seeds for conflict to come. So keep that in mind. So something that's important again is that like Steve again in this movie shows that he isn't afraid to break the rules in order to follow his moral code, but he's done with turning himself in at the end of breaking those rules within this movie. And he doesn't return to the institution that he was disobeying. He is, fully taking a moral stand. Like he's in the first movie, like even though he took a stand against the orders he was given, he still returned thinking that he could still be part of an organization that had different orders to give in the first place. Whereas in this movie, he's really seeing that organizations that he has to take a stand against aren't worth him taking a stand for in the first place. So this is where his like the arrogance to believe that you are in the right transcends into service. And it really is, it's very hard to determine looking in when I'm talking about like in our personal life when we are actually in the right, but you have to follow your instincts and you have to follow your heart to know that you are making the right choice to take a stand against certain things. So there is like this fine line, and other people may very heavily disagree with the stance that you take, but it is such an important part of leadership within this 31st gene key to know when to sever your ties with certain things, to take a stand against certain things, to break rules, and to not return to the places that you had to break those rules against. So at the end of this movie, Shield is gone, or like, you know, fallen apart, but then there's still Bucky. Bucky's brainwashed at this stage. He has been tortured and experimented on, and all these horrible things have been happening to him since Steve thought he died, like in World War II. So Steve really he wants to reach the humanity within Bucky, and he does this by just surrendering. Like he lets, but like the Bucky and Steve are in a fight, doing damage to each other, and Steve basically surrenders and he's like, I'm with you to the end of the line. Like I want you to remember who you are, and if I have to sacrifice myself to do that, then so be it. And we see like Bucky, it almost like breaks through a little bit, like he lets Steve live, and he drags him to safety and leaves him. And we see that sacrificial leadership again, that he took a stand, that it was like, I'm not going to fight my friend, I'm not going to hurt him, I need him to connect with his own humanity, and if me getting beaten to death is going to do that, then so be it. Again, like there's that hint of arrogance there, that it had to be him to reach Bucky, and even though it did have to be in these circumstances, that theme is still present there. And again, a lot of other things happen here, but watch the movie and I want you to fill in those gaps for yourself. So then we move into Avengers Age of Ultron and Civil War. Civil War is technically a Captain America movie, and we definitely kind of see more of the world through his lens in that movie, but it is basically half an Avengers movie, like all the Avengers are in it. So in Age of Ultron, the Avengers are still, they're working together. We see at the start of the movie them a team on a mission together, recovering the Mind Stone that is in the Loki's scepter, and we see them recovering that. So basically they're going around shutting down all the other Hydra operations and recovering things that they need. So yeah, he's part of the Avengers, but he's done with Shield. He's done with taking orders from government organizations. So this movie is where we meet Wanda Maximoff, and we also meet Pietro, her twin in this movie, that he unfortunately dies at the end of this movie. But we meet Wanda, and Wanda has mind control abilities. She's the Scarlet Witch. She's like early with using her powers in this movie. This is the first time we see her. So I mentioned this when I talked about the Hulk, but Wanda uses her powers to basically mind control all of the Avengers so that they are all confronted with their greatest fears. Steve's greatest fear is we see that, like, his fear is that the fight will end, that the fight will be over, and that he will have nothing left after the fight. And I think this is really telling to show like where his arrogance is present. And there's also layers of, trauma and all kinds of things to this, because like Steve is literally like a man out of time. Like he thought he sacrificed himself to save the world from Hydra, to be, reanimated in the world 70 years later, to find out that, Hydra was still there and that weren't actually defeated. They just went kind of underground and hid within plain sight. There's also, like he was in love with Peggy and he had to sacrifice his potential future with her to save the world. And um there's all of these things going on. And in this moment where he's part of the event, he was serving Shield and then he was part of the Avengers, it's like his life is about being in the fight, and he feels like there is nothing else for him outside of that. So there's this fear that the fight will end, and that arrogance is kind of coming from like that need for recognition, like to be recognized as worthy and valuable. Like he is a soldier still. So we start to see that Steve doesn't see himself as having power or value when he isn't leading a fight, when he isn't in his gift of leadership. So then another like key moment that happens in this movie is the Avengers are kind of like all just hanging out, and they all are just, like, so Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, it's whoever is worthy can lift Thor's hammer is, if you'll probably know that already if you've watched any MCU movie. So like all the Avengers and like some of the others just, hanging out casually, kind of making jokes about who can lift Thor's hammer and like proving who is worthy and who will be able to do it. And they all, try in different ways, all proving unworthy. But Thor, takes pause when Steve tries, and it's almost like it moves like this tiny little millimeter, like it makes this like little nudge and this little sound, and Thor is like, oh, like for a second, and then it's like, oh no, he can't lift it. And there is like these theories that say that Steve maybe could lift it, but he was trying to be humble and like not show off in the moment. I personally don't believe that, but I've seen people like say that online. But we'll talk. Steve does lift Mjolnir in Endgame, which I'll talk about when we get to that movie. So we see, also I'm kind of jumping around in this movie, not going through like the plot kind of consecutively, because a lot of different things happen that I feel like relate to Steve in his leadership journey. But we see Steve and Tony come into conflict again, even though like at this point they are they both believe they are on the same side and they are like supporting each other and they see the value in each other and in each other's leadership. They come into conflict when the approach that they each want to take to protect the people on Earth is very different. Tony wants to build a shield of armor around the world. He wants to create weapons. He wants to be proactive in the approach to protect Earth. Whereas Steve has a very different view of the world, and he's still in this kind of idealistic view of the world. And he says this line, he says something along the lines of those who try to prevent wars before they started often like cause more damage than good, or often end up, starting the wars, or something like that. Which is like very, very telling to his perception of the world. Like he doesn't want to build weapons. He doesn't want to create things that could be used in the destruction of the world. So Steve basically creates Ultron, that it was meant to be something that was, like of service to the world, but Ultron is created, which basically goes wrong. Steve is angry about this, and then so Steve goes to try to get Wanda And Pietro, like, he wants to see the best in them, and he's still very like idealistic at this point, and he becomes almost like this subtle mentor to bring Wanda and Pietro on their side. And then they try to stop Tony from so after Ultron like comes to life, they go to make Vision, and Vision is basically the superior version of Ultron who will have the Mind Stone within him. So I'm skipping so many details here, but I just want to keep it focused on Steve. So basically when Tony is about to bring Vision to life, Steve tries to stop him, and then Thor kind of comes in and brings Vision to life, like with his hammer, being like, no, like this is needed. And then Vision is alive. You know, it turns out he is good. The Avengers can trust him. And a selling point of that is that Vision lifts Thor's hammer. So they're all like, oh my God, yes, he's worthy. So they follow him, and Wanda and her brother are on the Avengers side. So Ultron is basically planning to destroy Earth. And he's at Sokovia, which is a like fictional country within the MCU. And he starts to like lift Sokovia from the ground to drop it and, you know, blow up the Earth basically to like, you know, eliminate humanity on Earth, because he spent a few minutes on the internet and determined, no, we need to start fresh. This is not cool. So then basically, you know, they evacuate everyone from Sokovia. But a lot of destruction was caused in the process, a lot of damage was done, and then that kind of plants seeds for what happens in Civil War. And then at the end of the movie, we see Steve become the leader for all the new Avengers recruits. There's Wanda, there's Vision, there's you know, like Falcon kind of like officially is joining. There was probably someone else that I'm missing as well. But we see Steve like really fully step into this leadership of like, I'm gonna lead this team and I'm going to indoctrinate people into my view of what we take stands for in the world and what we lead. So this movie kind of, yeah, again, sets up a lot of what's coming, but we also really see Steve really clinging to like his idealistic views of how to protect the world and how to be a leader. So then we move into Civil War, which is, you know, I find it just a sad movie because Steve and Tony, I feel like when they're working together, make such a great leadership duo. But because there is like that such high potential of light within the relationship, there is also the polarity of that, and we see that in full swing within Civil War. So the central conflict, there are basically two central conflicts within this movie, but I'll talk about the first one, is the Sokovia Accords. So Steve is an advocate for, he is pushing for government oversight and regulation of superpowered beings. And remember, Sokovia was the country within Age of Ultron that basically got destroyed because of the actions of the Avengers. And so then the government is like, okay, the Sokovia Accords is like this new legislation that like there needs to be regulation in some way. Like super powered beings can't just go and do what they want and make their own decisions. They need to report. They need to be, you know, regulated in some way. So Tony is pushing for that, and Tony is really driven by his fear. Again, like when Wanda mind controlled everyone, like Tony saw his fear as well, like of Earth being invaded and you know, Thanos coming, which he was. But you know, Steve is fighting for heroes to govern themselves. Like he again like has this idealistic view that superpowered beings, you know, like they know what to take a stand for, and everyone that's a hero will like fight in the right way, and that he can be a good leader for that and all of that. So and you know, like everything that happened with Shield and everything that has happened to Steve really makes him take a stand for like, no, like I'm not going back to taking orders from the government or from these people that, you know, have agendas and that have secrets and that are corrupted to the core. So Tony and Steve are on opposing sides, and even though, you know, like they want each other to come onto the other side, like they're still, even though there is this conflict within their views, like they still want to, they want the other one to support them at this stage. So then Bucky is so Bucky has kind of started to decondition from his programming as the Winter Soldier. Like the real Bucky is kind of back, but the so basically he's mind controlled at times to become the Winter Soldier again, and he's set up for blowing up the UN, the United Nations. And so basically there's like a warrant out for Bucky's arrest, but Steve wants to protect Bucky. He doesn't believe that he did it. He believes he's being set up, and he wants to protect him. So this again creates further conflict. Tony wants to bring Bucky in. He wants Bucky to be held accountable. He wants to follow like the Sokovia Accords. But Steve is like, no way, no way. I believe in my friend. I believe that I can help him. That blah blah blah. I believe he's being set up and all of that. So then Steve basically becomes a fugitive, fighting for what he believes in. He turns against his friends in the Avengers, or the ones that are taking Tony's side. And, you know, there is, you know, a big fight between the two sides of the Avengers. And then there is the further conflict of the movie where Tony finds out that Bucky, when he was mind controlled as the Winter Soldier, was responsible for Tony's parents' death, and Steve knew this. So then, you know, there is the fight between those three where Tony wants to fight Bucky, but Steve will not allow that. So there's that, and that basically results in the breakup of the team of the Avengers, because the two leaders had this massive falling out that seems unrepairable at that point. So at the end of this movie, all the people who supported Steve basically get arrested and put in this like underwater jail. And like Tony isn't, you know, like happy about it, happy about like betraying people that he, you know, once fought with, but he wants to stand by the Accords. And then at the end of the movie, we see Steve break out all those who supported him from the prison, and he goes on the run and he is a fugitive. And again, like we see him really taking a full stand. You know, he's standing by his word and he's standing by his beliefs, and he's taking a full stand that this was the right thing to do, but I'm not, no way in hell gonna serve the consequences that they determine. And I'm not gonna let anyone that supported me suffer any of these consequences as well. I'm breaking everyone out. Let's go on the run. And we don't know a lot about what Steve does. Like while they are on the run, we see them again in Infinity War. Yeah, he's on the run. Like he's made a full break from taking orders from other people. He is his full and independent leader at this point. But again, there's that arrogance of like he really believes that he did the right thing, that he made the right choice, that he was on the right side of these Accords. So then we come into Infinity War and Endgame. And I feel like these two movies really culminate the full character development and the full journey of going from arrogance to humility, but everything else was really building to this point. So a lot of things happen in Infinity War, but the key things I want to bring up is that the statement that Steve stands by for the entire Infinity War movie is that we don't trade lives. So basically, Vision has the Mind Stone. So Thanos is trying to collect all the Infinity Stones to basically kill half of the population of the whole universe. And Vision is animated by the Mind Stone that is in his head. And there is an argument for, and even Vision says, you know, like, sacrifice me, take the Mind Stone. Wanda is like capable of doing it. Like if we sacrifice the Mind Stone, then Thanos can't collect them all. And Steve is like, no, we don't trade lives. We're gonna stand by our morals, and we will defeat him because we always do, because we're heroes. Blah blah blah. So we don't trade lives is what he said. And if he had let Vision be sacrificed, like Vision asked to be from the beginning, perhaps Thanos would not have defeated them in the way that he did. There is, like Thanos did end up getting the time stone. So he may have been able to turn back time and got the Mind Stone still. But, they could have been another strategy, but Steve was like, no, like, we're not trading lives, we're not sacrificing anyone. Even though they went into a massive battle, and I have no doubt that people were killed or severely injured in that. But there was, we don't trade lives was his whole thing. And Steve became humbled by life when they lost. Thanos came, he got the Mind Stone, they lost, and half the universe died, or they turned to dust. They were gone. Bucky, Sam Wilson, Falcon, like many, many people, like half the universe were turned to dust. So many people that Steve personally cared about, but also, a huge ripple impact from that. And he lost. And like this is the first time, like in superhero movies, we expect the hero to win, but this is the first time we really see Steve face a loss, that like his choices and his leadership wasn't enough to save everyone, and that perhaps he made the wrong choice, standing by that we don't trade lives, and standing by that idealistic view. So then he's humbled, like all of them are humbled, they lost. So then we come into Endgame, and at the very beginning of Endgame, it's not long after the snap, and they're trying to find Thanos. They find him, but they discover that the stones are gone. There's no way they can undo what Thanos did. So then it's kind of like he's humbled again that they lost, and he can't rectify it. And then it quickly goes 5 years into the future. 5 years, it might be 5.5 years. So when we see Steve 5 years later, we see him leading in a different way after this deep humbling that he has had. We see that Natasha is leading what is left of the Avengers, that is leading efforts to to do all of the things that the Avengers like do in the world to protect people, to serve people. And Steve is still part of the team. Like he's still there supporting the team, but his leadership is being poured into a support group to help civilians process their loss. So we see him take this humble approach to his leadership, and to know that like his voice and his leadership is useful in a different way to just being a soldier, to just fighting. Then the fight begins to bring everyone back. The Ant-Man comes back from the quantum realm, which triggers Tony to invent time travel, which triggers the plan to collect the Infinity Stones from the past to bring everyone back to the present time. So the fight is on. Steve is part of the fight. He's called into the fight. He is back as a soldier. And now so in Infinity War, it was we don't trade lives, but in Endgame, he's very much of whatever it takes. And whatever it takes is, we see like that is such a shift in his attitude. Like he's willing for other people to sacrifice themselves. He's willing for other people to make the decision when they can sacrifice himself. Like he's in this position now where his arrogance and his idealistic view, that is fueled by his arrogance, is not going to get in the way of the greater good, of half the universe coming back, whatever it takes. So then throughout this movie, there are many things that happen. It is really focused on the initial 6 Avengers. So Steve does, like we see a lot of him in this movie. And part of it is we see Steve confront his past self. So they go back in time, and they're back at the time where the first Avengers movie was occurring. So when they first had this team up, and Steve was very much, just out of the eye, still in that soldier boy mode. So Steve has to fight his past self from that time, and even he like cringes at his arrogance. So like the Steve from the past is like, I can do this all day, like very much like, like just arrogant and, soldier, all of that. And yeah, present day Steve, who, has been through a lot and a lot of evolution, is just like, like, I'm done. Like, he no longer wants to fight all day. He no longer wants to do this all day. He wants to, get in, get what he needs and get out of there. And we see that is like a massive shift. Like, Steve has really moved through the fear of the fight being over. He wants the fight to be over at this point. But when there is a fight, he's still willing to be there for it. So then, basically their time travel, they come back, and then there is the final battle with Thanos. And in this final battle, Steve wields Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. He is worthy at this point. He has let go of his agenda to just fight. He's really embracing moving towards that high frequency of humility, of, not needing to be in a fight to prove himself, having nothing to prove, but still being there to stand up for what he believes in and still being there for the fight. So he is worthy, which it's a really cool moment when we see him pick up the hammer. So then basically big fight, they've already before that moment of him wielding Mjolnir, they already brought back half of, like, all the people that got snapped away. But then, a mistake that was made when they traveled back in time brought a past version of Thanos into their present timeline, which basically caused, like, the end fight. So then, they defeat Thanos. They, Tony sacrifices himself to, like, make the ultimate sacrifice at the end. And I think this, really, in when Steve first met Tony, he said to him, like, you're not the one to make the sacrifice play, like, you're too selfish, essentially. And we're going to talk about Tony a little more in a moment. But we see time and time again that Tony is willing to make the sacrifice play, but it isn't done in an arrogant way, in the way that Steve makes sacrifice plays. So there's a difference there. But Steve has to say goodbye to Tony after they somewhat reconciled, after in the 5 years that had passed since, like, Tony got back to Earth. So from, like, being stranded in space. So then at the end of the movie, after Thanos is defeated, everyone's back and all of that, Steve is sent on the mission to go back into the past to put back all of the Infinity Stones from where they were taken from, so that the timeline doesn't, spread and new timelines are created. So he has everything he needs to go put back. And then so they say that it should be just a split second that they'll send him back, and then he'll do what he needs to do, and then it should be the next second that he reappears after doing his mission. But he goes back, and then at the time he was meant to come back to, like, the present time, he's not there. So they realize that he stayed back in time because the old man version of him is there. In that moment. So he made the decision to stay back in time, to live out his life in his time period, like the time that he should have got to live a full life in. And when we see him as the old man, he hands his shield to Sam Wilson to become the new Captain America. So one of the biggest criticisms that I see about Steve's ending within the MCU is that his decision to stay in his time in, like, the 1940s, or might have been early 50s, like, whenever exactly it was, it felt selfish, and it felt like something else Steve wouldn't do, that there is no way he could know all about all the horrible things that were happening to Bucky, that were happening with Shield, like with Hydra there, and throughout the rest of the world, like all the things, like, he knew were coming and were going to happen. Like, there's no way he could know that and sit back and do nothing to prevent or change these outcomes. Like, that is one of the biggest criticisms that I see. But I think that this actually shows his full character growth into humility and into a very, like, higher frequency of his leadership, and that him not interfering in order to preserve the timeline and actually get to live his life is such a beautiful ending to his story arc into humility, because he know at this point, like, he's not arrogant enough to still believe that he's the only leader with the right view of life, or the only person that can save everyone. Like, he knows that there are other heroes, there are other leaders, and he has accepted that, you know, there is fate, there is forces at play, that life will be as life is, and he knows that. um he's accepted that whatever, like, the story that has happened in the timeline he is in is the story of that timeline, and it is not his place to interfere with the fates of life from the past. And he knew that in the current time period, that you know, where everyone else, where the main story is, he knew that, you know, there were heroes capable of doing everything he could have done in that timeline as well, and he hands over the mantle of Captain America to Sam, and he knows that it is in good and capable hands. So we don't know exactly what he did. We see him, you know, have his dance with Peggy. We don't know exactly what happened after that, but we can assume that he was humble to life. He fulfilled his role as a leader, and he fulfilled his role in life and in the story of life, and he was humble enough to surrender after that. So I think it's really interesting to see, like, this whole journey. And even though it's like, yes, of course I want to see more of Steve Rogers, I want to see more of Chris Evans in the MCU, I think he had a really beautiful story arc that ended in a way that really honored his journey to seeing the role he had, and being humble enough to fully surrender his arrogance to his attachments to being a soldier, to being recognized, and needing to prove himself, to thinking that he's the only one that can save people. So that is the journey through Steve Rogers with the 31st Gene Key within the MCU. There are probably many other moments. I would love to hear moments that come to your mind that really demonstrate his leadership or his arrogance or his humility within the MCU. I would love to hear the examples that you have. And again, like, there are many details that I left out for the sake of time to go through all of this. He had a very, you know, long story with many movies in the MCU, but I think it's really cool when we get to see characters that do have a lot of movies, because we see a lot of their development, we see their evolution, and we can really pull out these themes. And even though Steve Rogers, Captain America, was a great hero, he was also human, and he was also flawed in ways as well. And that is the same with you and your experience with your leadership and your gene keys, that even though you have these amazing gifts and these amazing qualities, there is always that polarity and that the potential shadows to come into that, especially when egos and agendas and control and all of that come into play. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Steve Rogers, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Sam Wilson as well. So I see the 27th gene key being the perfect leadership partner, the perfect co-captain, co-leader to the 31st gene key. And this is a pattern I've recognized across different forms of media. So like, there's Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. And if you are a fan of, like, Toy Story, my nephew had this phase where he was obsessed with Toy Story. So I was watching those movies all the time whenever he was over. And something I really noticed is that Buzz and Woody are, again, like, a perfect example of the 31st and 27th gene keys leading together, and they lead in different ways, but they need to be together to strengthen their leadership nonetheless. So the 27th gene key, the shadow is selfishness, the gift is altruism, and the city is selflessness. So selfishness, you know, being prone to selfish acts that harm the whole. The selfishness ultimately cuts them off from others, and they can become very self-centered with an agenda and only give from their mind. I think, you know, that very much encapsulates Tony Stark, Iron Man's journey when he's in his shadows, and even hints of that through his whole story within the MCU. But within that is the gift of altruism, of true generosity, of giving in a detached way, being connected to the needs of the group and giving in an altruistic way and deeply valuing education and nurturing children. And I think Tony gets a lot of criticism for his selfishness, but I think truly in his heart or like at his soul, he wants to give and he wants to be generous. And we see him generous, he's a billionaire. He gave a lot of resources and funding to the Avengers team, but he's also very giving with his mind, with his intelligence, with his creations. And sometimes his agendas creep in and that can cast these shadows on his actions. But I think he was very altruistic in nature and he ultimately was selfish. When he was called to, he had the full capacity to be selfless. In the first Avengers movie, he was prepared to sacrifice himself to save everyone. He ultimately he didn't, but he made the ultimate sacrifice in Endgame to save everyone. Um and there's this sometimes when the 31st gene key is in their shadow of arrogance and when the 27th is in their shadow of selfishness, like they kind of project their shadows onto each other and they see each other in the way that they are actually behaving. But when they in their gifts of leadership and altruism, they work together so well and they create this very dynamic duo pairing that I think is really powerful. I'm not going to go fully into examples of this or anything like that, but I think it can be really powerful to explore how you see that. And are there any other pairings that you see across media or in your life that you think enhances the 31st gift of leadership or the gift of leadership that you have? And I feel like for me personally, I feel like I have a very deep connection to this duo because the 27th Jinky is my life's work and the 31st is my purpose. And I have seen so many people that have that same like pairing as I do in their Jinkies profile. So it's a very like common um to have those two Jinkies like within your activation sequence. And um yeah, so I may be speaking from like a personal bias of like having that deep connection myself, but I see it so regularly that I think it can't be by coincidence. And I think that the gifts of both of these gene keys really strengthen each other. Okay, the last thing we're going to, the last gene key and Avenger or MCU character we're going to cover is Sam Wilson, the new Captain America. And I really wanted to bring Sam up because it's about like Steve Rogers and Sam, they're both versions of the mantle, like the hero of Captain America. But because they are so different as people, they lead in such different ways. And I really see Sam as an archetype for the 48th gene key. And I feel like we haven't fully fleshed out Sam as a leader. We saw him basically as a sidekick. We saw him as so we saw Sam more as a sidekick within the MCU movies when Steve Rogers was still in the story. So when we met him, he's introduced as like a friend or like someone that Steve meets, and he's basically just supporting Steve's action. So we see that he's willing to take a stand with Steve, but we don't see a lot of what motivates him, what drives him, and what his shadows are. But we see his capabilities, we see his willingness to fight. And it isn't until his series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, that I feel like, or at least I could see a little bit of a deeper side to his character and to who he really was, to what his fears and desires and all of those things really were. And I'm excited to see where his story leads. I'm pretty sure he's getting a solo movie, and I'm sure he'll be in more or in the future Avengers movies as well. So this is basically like him displaying a story arc with this 48th gene key. I think this is fully explored within the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series. So the shadow is inadequacy, and this is a shadow that really undermines you and it gives rise to a very deep human fear that you are fundamentally inadequate. And this is one of the darker encodings within the Gene Key shadows. And in this shadow, you can create this false sense of reality, this false like illusion of reality to make yourself feel more secure. Basically, like you tell yourself what you need to hear in order to not feel like you are completely inadequate, but that is still rooted in the feeling of being inadequate. The gift within that is the gift of resourcefulness, the gift of being willing to dive into that deep void within you and not fearing the dark void and knowing that you can reach into it and pull out whatever you need. You become resourceful in all ways. And with this trust, all that mental anxiety about being inadequate is lessened and you surrender it bit by bit. And you naturally start to pull out solutions to any challenge. And you start to have this deep integrative power where you are designed to unite enemies rather than just fight against them. And then the city is wisdom, and you do not attain wisdom, you simply have it within the story of this Jinky. So, where I see this playing out for Sam is that so we see that, Steve gave him the shield. Steve Rogers chose Sam to be the next Captain America, but Sam initially feels inadequate to take on this mantle and he gives the shield over to the government essentially, and they go and pick someone else to be Captain America. And Sam, kind of has to come to terms with his inadequacy around like why he feels like he cannot have the shield and he cannot be Captain America. So we see his inadequacy kind of play out in that way. And then, there's a lot of other things that happen in the series, but ultimately we see Sam surrender that feeling of inadequacy and take on the shield anyway and become Captain America anyway. And we see his resourcefulness a lot, even through the MCU movies, actually. I think we see a lot of his resourcefulness, but we see his resourcefulness in the way that he fights within the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series. And we see his wisdom on full display as well, and his gift of resourcefulness in terms of having an integrative power. We see that as well in one of like the final battles where like towards the end of the battle, he's speaking with members of the government. I forget exactly who they were. And he basically like gives this speech that is really channeling deep wisdom in an attempt to unite sides. It's not like Steve very much had the approach that it's like, this is the right side, this is the wrong side, and I'm gonna fight and get rid of you. Whereas Sam is very much like, let's come together and let's find a common goal and a common path and let's move forward in a way that is of benefit to the collective and to the whole. And he has that very integrative nature because of the wisdom that he brings through. And of course, Sam Wilson has had a very vastly different life experience to Steve Rogers, but I think it's really cool how this path of the 48th Gene Key is really on display within his journey. So even though they are both Captain America, or they have both, held that title of Captain America, they still lead in very different ways. It is through Sam's wisdom that people see him as a leader, even though there isn't that need of having anything to prove or to be in a fight. He would actually rather not be in a fight. And bring people together before the fight is necessary. So some prompts for you to contemplate and to muse with is, what leaders in your life, in the world, and even throughout media do you see embodying the 31st Gene Key and this style of leadership? And do you see it within yourself as well? And when you look at characters or people who are emulating the gifts or even the shadows within this 31st Gene Key, can you see where they are mirrored within yourself? Can you see the qualities that often the qualities you admire most in others or that you feel most connected to with others are things that are within you, either at the surface or a little deeper down? So I feel like I have this deep resonance with Steve Rogers because I connect so much with his style of leadership. And I also feel that, with Tony Stark and with a lot of the others who I share Gene Keys with. So what heroes are you naturally drawn to? What qualities do you admire within them? and where do you see that within yourself? And particularly focusing on the 31st Jinky, are there any other heroes, or they don't need to be super powered heroes, they can be characters across any kind of media or world leaders or public figures or anything like that, where you see like this gift of the 31st Jinky. And I think that seeing it in media, like fictional media, is often a little easier to recognize because sometimes we can't recognize their gifts without actually seeing them in their shadows. And we don't get a full dive into like the full character of um people unless there has been like that full exploration of them. So some movies where they stay so like surface level, it is kind of harder to see the gifts because we don't actually see the human shadow side of them. So I just want you to contemplate and muse on like who have you seen this journey of the 31st Gene Key with, and if you have, like, what are the characters that are around them and supporting them and enhancing their leadership? What gene keys or gifts do you feel like they may be bringing into that relationship? Looking at the shadows, like how do the shadows of arrogance, selfishness, and inadequacy that we have explored today, how do any of those come up within you? And can you actually see the gift that is within those shadows? And also explore, how do you trigger those shadows in other people? And how does that come up? And what actually may be something you're projecting onto others as opposed to seeing it fully and surrendering to it within yourself? And then the last is, what do, like, everything that we have explored today, what does this exploration bring up within you? Like, just find a little thread and just start to muse on it, contemplate with it, and that will pull the thread to slowly unravel it. And I would love to hear any insights or revelations or just thoughts and musings that you have based on anything we have covered. So thank you so, so much for being here for this call. In our next call, we're going to talk about the 21st Gene Key. We're going to talk about T'Challa, the Black Panther. And I'm so, so excited. I think T'Challa is the perfect example for the 21st Gene Key arc. And I think you're really, really going to love that exploration. So thank you so, so much for being here. Have such an amazing day. Please reach out. I would love to hear your thoughts, questions, and comments around everything we have covered. And just stay open and curious and gentle with yourself as you muse and contemplate with all that we have explored.